Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Monday, February 17th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with diplomatic correspondent Laser Berman. Hi, Laser.
Hi, Jessica. Good morning.
Good morning to you. It is day 500 of the war. This morning, marking the start of the 500th day of captivity, hostage families gathered on Jerusalem's Aza Road before marching to the Knesset for the official start of a fast day that's been called, or 500 minutes of fasting. As one family member remarked at the start of the march, the hostages have been fasting for 500 days in essence. There are gatherings and protests planned throughout the country and throughout the day, culminating with an 8 p.m. end to the fast and a rally at Tel Aviv's Hostages Square. Meanwhile, following the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio in Israel yesterday, discussions continue regarding talks for a stage 2 of the ceasefire, as well as ongoing comments and discussions about whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu intends that phase to happen. We'll talk about all of that and Rubio's visit after a quick break. Okay, so Laser, here we are on this 500th day of captivity. Quite a few days. Are we 2 weeks now past the deadline for the beginning of the second stage of the talks for phase 2? And covering all of this right now and Rubio's visit yesterday, where would you say we are in terms of hostage talks, of ongoing hostage talks?
So I think if you had asked me that yesterday morning, I would have given you a very different answer, because yesterday was actually a pretty dramatic day in terms of where we are in the attempts to move to some next phase, whether it's the second phase, whether it's back to war. But yesterday was a big day. And it was not a big day because of any contacts that Israel has had with Egypt and Qatar and through them to Hamas. It was a big day because of what messages were coming out of senior U.S. officials. So we have the visit of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's obviously been here before, but this is his first trip to Israel as Secretary of State, someone who's very, very pro-Israel, someone who knows all the leadership. And you can hear that from his message. The message that came out of, first of all, Netanyahu, they gave these joint statements after their meeting, was that we have a quote unquote common strategy with the Trump administration. So he was stressing how deeply synchronized he and Trump are. And that was also reflected in Netanyahu's statements ahead of the weekly cabinet meeting, the ones that he released before the majority of it, which is not given to the press. And he talked about how he has been cultivating this relationship with Donald Trump for years. Kind of gave a pretty obvious dig at the Biden administration. So we've had some much less supportive administrations that I know how to deal with, but I cultivated these ties with Trump and his people, not for partisan reasons, but for Zionist reasons, because we have this opportunity here, which is unprecedented in Israeli history. He seemed to be referring the ability to clear the threats from Israel's borders and move toward this new acceptance in the region, Saudi Arabia, and so on. And in Rubio's words, it seemed to be the same. I mean, he ended, first of all, with this praise of Israel. If there were more Israels in the Middle East, it would be a safer place. It's this paragon of pluralism and democracy, and so on. And he talked about the need to eliminate Hamas, right? They must be eradicated. They can never be allowed to rule the Gaza Strip again. They can't be allowed to militarily or have any government function. If we do that, as Rubio said, then we're just going to keep going back to where we were. And he also talked about the importance and praised Trump's vision for Gaza, however it's going to look, that otherwise we're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So there it seemed like the Trump administration, Netanyahu, were so coordinated, and there was going to be no real pressure to seriously talk about the second phase of this deal. Let me remind our listeners, the second phase of the deal would mean, unless Hamas changes its negotiating stance, that Israel ultimately, if it goes through, gets back all the hostages and pulls all of its troops out of Gaza, which means the war is over. Hamas has guarantees that the war is over and can say that it won, right? It got out thousands of prisoners. was able to withstand the IDF's full might, was able to take its revenge, was able to get the Palestinian issue back on the world agenda, and it's there and it's still kicking, even though it suffered greatly for its people. That would be the meaning of moving to phase two as it stands right now, and you can see why that doesn't sit well with Netanyahu or some of his coalition. However, Steve Witkoff, who's the U.S. Special Envoy, who has been very active in the hostage talks and other issues as well, including emerging talks on the end of the Ukraine war, perhaps. He said in a Fox News interview before he flew to Saudi Arabia that the second phase will happen and that there were going to be talks this week on how to move to the second phase. And then shortly afterward, and that he had spoken to Netanyahu this morning, Sunday morning, he spoke to Egypt's intelligence chief, who's the one who's been leading that on the Egyptian side, and he spoke to the Qatari prime minister. So all the main players he was sure to speak to. And then he came out with that statement that, we're going to talk about when the timing of the second phase and when it happens. I'll also note that he pointed at this same paradox that I was just talking about before of the second phase, that it envisions all the hostages coming out, but it also envisions an end to the war. And the Trump administration has said repeatedly that Hamas cannot be allowed to remain as a power in Gaza. So he said himself, he's not really sure how to square that circle. But shortly after the Witkoff interview, the Prime Minister's office came out with two statements. They said that, first of all, there would be a team going to Cairo, not Doha this time, to Cairo, to talk about the continued implementation of the first phase. And then that there would be, after the cabinet meeting, which will be tonight, Monday evening at 6:30, then they will get instructions on what to say about the second phase. And then there was a subsequent statement that the talks about the second phase would be about talking about the day after and not about the second phase as laid out in the agreement. So it still remains clear, but I think we're starting to see that there is pressure, it would seem, and there are some reports that say that this came about from pressure from Witkoff, pressure from Rubio. That's why Netanyahu sent that team, even though he denies it, and that Netanyahu has a different vision, though it's not exactly sure what Netanyahu wants to do moving forward. Right? If you remember last week, after Trump said that all the hostages must leave, you had these 4 Israeli statements in one night that were contradictory. All of them should go. 9 should go. Our hostages should go. So it's not clear what Netanyahu wants to do. There is some logic to continuing to remain somewhat uncommitted, unclear. But at some point, as you indicated, we're moving toward the end of the first phase. There's only 2 more releases left. And Hamas signaled that it does not accept the fact that there's not real talks yet on the second phase. So things are getting dicey. And you're going to need to see some direction from the Netanyahu people on where do we want to go from here and how do we achieve the war goals, which are contradictory within themselves, while not upsetting the Trump administration.
Okay, thanks for that, Laser. Let's go to a quick break. And when we're back, we'll keep on going with the topic of the hostage talks and the deal and what could be next. So stay with us. Okay, but Laser, last night, one of the other things that happened was that an unnamed official from the Prime Minister's office came out as saying that the fact that no delegation has been sent from Israel to the talks, that the talks haven't begun, that we're 2 weeks behind in the talks, means that we're already late for the, I believe, March 5th deadline for this second phase. Now, one could say, okay, dates are not the most essential thing here, but that is the concept of a ceasefire, right? There are deadlines within the ceasefire. There are points that were agreed upon that need to be kept to in a ceasefire. So talk us through that a little bit. In other words, how much does it matter that we are behind and that, as you just said, we need to sort of hear now from Netanyahu and the cabinet about what are their intentions with regard to the second stage, which is what, of course, all the hostage families are all yelling about. Those who haven't had their loved ones released home, they're just worried that this ceasefire is going to come to, a stuttering halt and that war will start again in Gaza.
Yeah, so ceasefires and these type of agreements are only reflective of your power or what you've achieved on the ground, right? So the fact that it says something, if you want to violate it, go ahead. But if the other side has the ability to, inflict pain on you because you violate it, then everything could fall apart. Then why did you go into it in the first place? Although there is some logic to do partial deals. So the fact that Israel was supposed to engage, like you said, 2 weeks ago on February 3rd, while the prime minister was in Monday, that was when the talks on the second phase were supposed to begin. It was the 16th day of the first phase. A very senior Israeli official told me the fact that Israel is talking to Witkoff and Mike Waltz, the national security advisor in Washington, is the start of talks during the second phase. Now, that's certainly conceivable, but nothing was followed up. Okay. That only matters because Hamas clearly didn't like it. And that's when they started threatening to not carry out the sixth hostage release, which was on Saturday. Ultimately, they did, as we know. But that's the reason that it matters, that it could cause, as we're getting to the end of the first phase, it could cause it all to fall apart. And let me point out something here. This is the way I explain the first and second phase and what everyone's interests are. Israel went into this deal to have the first phase, not the second phase. The first phase for Israel means you get a lot of hostages out and you don't commit to ending the war, right? That's great for Israel. Therefore, there is a desire amongst Israel's leadership to try to extend this first phase. It's going to coincide with the beginning of Ramadan, which starts at the end of February. And there's some hope that with kind of Arab world pressure, there could be some sort of an extension based on the fact that, we want to make sure that we're not having war during Ramadan and it serves everyone's interest. Hamas, on the other hand, took this deal because they believe that the first phase will get them to the second phase, which is the end of the war. All right, it doesn't serve their interest to release hostages and have some limited ceasefire. It serves their interest to have this thing end and have them survive. So that's where we're starting to see, as we're getting to the end of the first phase, that there are these conflicting interests, and that's where everyone is talking about how do we square this circle. What Israel would say is that we're willing to go to the second phase, but we have our demands and they haven't changed. If Hamas leadership leaves Gaza and if they disarm and if someone else comes in, then yeah, we can go to the second phase. Why not get our hostages out and the war's over because we've achieved our goals? The chances of that happening are very, very slim, in my opinion.
The chances of getting to the second phase are very, very slim.
The chances of Hamas raising its hands and saying we lost and we're going to leave, vanishingly small, and therefore it's hard to imagine how exactly we get to the second phase. If the Trump administration decides we really want this and we're going to make this clear to Israel, it could start to happen, and then it would be on Israel to try to find ways to make sure that it maintains the ability to not declare the end of the war, because that would create a bunch of new problems for Israel. I mean, all the troops are out. It would mean, I would imagine, that people would be very, very wary about returning to their communities around the Gaza Strip. And then, one rocket from Gaza, which we saw fired last week even, it would become a huge political problem. So this is very, very fraught, and it will not be easy to move to that second phase. And again, you have the Trump administration saying consistently Hamas must be eliminated, which under the second phase, unless Hamas just gives up, it wouldn't happen. It would mean Hamas survives. Maybe someone else is officially ruling the Gaza Strip, but you know who will be the real power there.
Okay, so Laser, bringing us back to the start of the podcast, talking about Rubio's visit and Witkoff's comments on Fox, and Netanyahu saying, this is the real connection that we have here. They get me and I get them. In other words, in terms of Trump, Netanyahu. So where do you really see, in terms of the diplomacy here, what do you actually see possibly happening in terms of the Trump administration working with Netanyahu and his cabinet and moving toward anything? Do you see that actually happening? Is it going to be Netanyahu leading Trump or Trump leading Netanyahu, in your estimation?
It's a good question. Well, we've seen how well Netanyahu is able to understand what Trump and his administration, how to talk to them, how to explain things to them. And it seems like he's done that very successfully before he came into office, and certainly since he's come to office. He's going to have to elucidate a clear vision of what happens if we don't go to a full second phase, why that's good for everybody. And he's going to have to play to that Trump idea that, he's making peace through strength. Is a return to war part of that? It's uncomfortable, but he'll have to use all of his skills of persuasion to make that case. But again, Netanyahu has to decide where he wants to go. Does he want to go back to war? Has he made that decision? I think a lot of Israel would support him, right? If at some point we go back to war, but we do it in a much more coherent way than we did for much of the previous war, the previous phase of the war. So all these statements that, we've rolled back the Iranians and we've done so much. Yeah, but we have achieved zero of the goals of the war in Gaza, even though, in Lebanon, very successful. Syria fell apart. You still don't have all the hostages home. Hamas still runs what goes on in Gaza. It still has a coherent military wing. Gaza is still a threat to Israel. So nothing has been achieved yet in terms of the goals. We're on our way there, but if we stop now, we won't have. So Netanyahu really has to start figuring out how he wants to do that. And this kind of vague statements, they might serve him, give him some time to make some decisions to communicate and to talk to the Trump administration. But at some point, that decision has to be made.
Okay. Thanks for that, Laser. It's helpful as we go into today and see what today brings, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's day 500, so that's what Israel, the country, and Israeli society is focused on. And it's certainly a poignant day. And it's, I think it's an important day also in terms of the timeline of the war, because we have that team going to Egypt, and there's going to be continued questions about what we want to do, or what Israel wants to do. And there's that cabinet meeting tonight, which will make the decision on what it wants to do about talks for the second phase.
All right. Thanks for that. We will see what today brings. It's been good to have you here on the Daily Briefing.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always drop us an email, podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, be well, have yourselves a good week.